Would you do me the honour of just bowing for a moment and praying? Heavenly Father, I pray that what I say today may be of use and of encouragement, that it might build understanding. I am no theologian, Lord, I do not pretend to be. So I pray that you will excuse any errors I make, omissions I make, but that your name will be glorified. In the name of Christ. Amen. Julia and I have loved being with you. It's always wonderful to meet more members of the family. One of the most remarkable things about the Christian walk is that you have a family of brothers and sisters in Christ and an instant relationship and a bond that supplants even those that you have with many of your own blood, really, and your own families often. So thank you for your hospitality. Can I say to you also that as I just prayed, I'm not a theologian. And sometimes when I'm asked to do something like a weekend of this sort, I kind of bumble in and accept an invitation to preach. I don't know that I should. What I really want to say to you, is that we're unbelievable. I mean, I come from the Armidale Diocese, my wife and I, and like the Sydney Diocese, its pulpits in the Anglican Church are filled with people who are highly trained, believe the Bible, and bring it to life. And so you have Raj and you have Ben and you have Mark and you have others in your midst who are really able to serve you faithfully and do so. They've made enormous sacrifices. They're very bright and capable people who could have gone and made a fortune for themselves. We're going to talk about that obsession with money this morning a bit. They've chosen not to do that. They've chosen to forego great material wealth and status in the community and those sorts of things to serve God and to serve you. So please honour them for that and recognise what a gift that is. Now, we've been talking about the modern world and the mess we've got into, and I've been trying to drill down into why that is. It has to do with our self-obsession, with what the Bible calls sin, our desire to do it our way, not God's way, and the way in which God grieves over that and still offers us a way back. And we're going to try and bring that to life this morning. If you doubt, though, before I start, that we're obsessed with money in our society, let me refer you to the advertising industry. Big Brother is watching. The advertising industry is quite brilliant. Anybody who's not brilliant in the advertising industry doesn't win lucrative contracts to advertise products. So they do their research and their focus group works and so forth to find out what you believe and what you desire and who you're really at. And the sort of ads that you see that really bring this to life for me and tell the grim story, I can think of one that I haven't seen now for a few years, but it was one of the major banks. I won't say which one in case some of you might work for that bank, I've insulted New Zealanders and Americans and who else have I... I'd hate to offend bankers as well. I'll never be asked back. But they had an ad, a full-page newspaper, and it had a hand pointing out of it, a bit like the recruiting poster that you've all seen, Uncle Sam needs you in the war. And the block headline was, look after the most important person in the world. An even bigger block down the bottom, just 3 letters, 1 word. You know what it was? You. How many of you are parents and have noticed that that's actually a problem at home, isn't it? You don't have to teach your little blighters that it's all about them, do you? And a big part of your task is to get them to think of other people and not act as though it's all about them. And a big part of our society's problem is that we all think we're the centre of our own universe. And I recently saw this summed up again, the 2 slogans that perhaps say it most effectively for me out of the advertising industry at the moment. I was in Canberra. I don't go there very often these days. Some people call it, out my way, they're a bit cynical. They call it the city of 300,000 surrounded by reality. So now I've offended anybody who's visiting from Canberra. But that's not true. It's not true. But there was an ad there for a retirement village, encouraging you to buy one of these. And it had both lines in one ad. Buy this product, you deserve it. It's all about you. So that's where we're at, isn't it? Now, the story of the prodigal son, as it's known, is actually about the very, very deep trouble that 2 brothers get themselves into because they are self-obsessed. And the extraordinary thing that is usually seen is that one of them is massively blessed because he comes to see how much trouble he has visited upon himself by his self-obsession. But the other son, the older one, who's often not focused on when this story is told, amazingly appears not to be in trouble, but in fact, just like the other brother, is self-obsessed and is not blessed with realising his problem. And then we have the figure of the father, and I'm going to try and say something about him that will bring him to life today. This is not an allegory. He is not meant to be God in Jesus' story, but he is plainly a symbol of a God who is there, who is unbelievably gracious and concerned, and who rushes out to meet us the minute we begin to show signs of repentance. Theologically, of course, it is he who brings us to that point anyway. But this is a remarkable story. And one of the things that strikes me about it, I'm no great intellect and I'm not a theologian, but I have been in the game of communications, trying to get messages over. And when I read this parable, I realise that these are the words of a man who is no mere mortal. This power-packed parable it's a double parable, actually. It's known as a double parable. It's in two halves, the older son, the younger son, the older son, and they're written in extraordinarily tight language and an unbelievable sort of poetry in the original that reveals Jesus as a man who is of far superior intellect to all of the people who would deny him and tear him down and try and discredit him today, the Richard Dawkinses and the Christopher Hitchenses of this world. One of the reasons I believe in Jesus is that these parables are plainly not just written or spoken by a mere man. They're not. But let's come to the actual reading. It wasn't in the reading, but just to contextualise it, the scene is, you can imagine somewhere out in the Middle East, we'd like to think a little grassy knoll, a few people sitting around. We're told in the first two verses that the tax collectors and the sinners, now, nice moderate word, happens to come to pass, that the tax collectors and the sinners have obviously heard Jesus is around. He's an intriguing person. What do? They gather. That implies that they came voluntarily. They wanted to hear this bloke. They gathered around to hear him. In contrast to the first verse, which begins now, the second one is but. Different scene altogether. The link here. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they were paying attention too. And they were unhappy. This man is disrupting the order. He's creating a rabble. And he is plainly a bad bit of news, a bad man, not to be trusted, certainly not a good man. Why? Because he welcomes sinners and eats with them. Now, I said at the earlier service, I owe a great deal for what I'm trying to say this morning to a man called Kenneth Bailey. He's an American. I see a man nodding. A remarkable book. He's written several, but this one's called Poet and Peasant Through Peasant Eyes. And he lived in the Middle East for a long time so that he could absorb the culture of the place and bring to life some of these scenes. And the first point to make out of this is that he would say to you that for a Middle Easterner, when we're told that the Pharisees were complaining because Jesus eats with them, eating with people is to identify with them. It's to more than identify with them. It's to honour them. So what the Pharisees are saying is, they're the good guys, we're the good guys. The tax collectors and the sinners are the bad guys. Jesus is plainly an enemy of us because he's identifying with these bad people. There's no graciousness about them at all. Jesus knows what's on their mind. And he tells them a parable. In fact, several parables. You get the story of the lost sheep. Do you remember that one? And then you get the story of the lost coin, the widow and the lost coin. Great rejoicing when the one sheep out of the 100 is found. Great rejoicing when the lost coin is found. He then goes into two people, both of whom are lost. One of whom is found, and about which there might be great rejoicing, and one of whom is not. And that would have caused, for those who understood it, great concern. And it ought to in our hearts and minds as well. In fact, it seems to be the case that the two sons represent two types of people. One, those people who perhaps never go to church, don't try to be good. They're out there as tearaways. The other who outwardly conform, do all the right thing. Good children. Go to church. Pay their taxes. But actually, they've both got the same problem. They hate God. And one of the great blessings is to, I think, gain that insight, that our core problem is that we love the good things God gives us, but we don't love God. Our natural inclination, our default position is to say, it's about me, and I'm going to look after me, and I'm going to do it in my own strength. And I've often been intrigued by Jesus' two great commandments. When the scribe says to him, what are the great commandments? He says, the two great commandments are these. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, soul, I've got the order wrong here deliberately, and mind. And mind. We need to engage our minds so that we actually understand who we are. Because most of us are not who we think we are. And the older son here is not who we think we are on first examination either. So let me briefly try and go over the story of the younger son. It's well known to you all. You'll know it quite well. He does an absolutely outrageous thing. He goes to his father and says, I want my inheritance. I want that share of the estate. It would have only been probably a quarter. Some of you may know the history better than me. It wouldn't have been, the older brother would have got the greater share. But nonetheless, his father, as emerges, is a patriarch. He was a wealthy elder, owned land, headed up a big household, had many servants, and a very respected man. He goes to him and says, I want my inheritance now. And Kenneth Bailey, who understands these societies, these Middle Eastern cultures, says that is an outrageous thing to do, and it would have brought a sharp gasp from the Jewish listeners of the time, because it is in effect to say, I wish you were dead. That's what it means in that culture. And actually ours is not quite so different. We think it is. I told the story earlier, though, when I was a young man at a Christmas party once, long before I met Julia, and an old man, and he's long gone, you don't know him, so I can say it to you, wasn't a very nice man. And he had a couple of Christmas drinks, and he started poking me in the chest. He said, the trouble with you young blokes, you're all just waiting for us to drop off a twig so you can have your farms. And I remember thinking, that was a terrible thing to say. But you know, I've had 19 years in public life, and one of the things that strikes me is how sad many people's declining years are. And I meet people who work in nursing homes, and often they will say to me, you know, it's just dreadful the way people treat their elder parents. When they get a bit gaga, they stop visiting. And when they rarely do come in, you have some count. Sometimes you just get the impression they're waiting for them to drop off the twig so they can sell the family house. So that's this guy. And by the law and the custom of the day, Jesus' listeners, pre-television, you know, it's hard for us to imagine. This would have been very important for them. Entertainment, opportunity to learn something. Would have been a very exciting moment. And this is a thriller that Jesus is telling them, and they'd be thinking, the next turn of the story, we're going to see how the father gets even with this rotten, evil son who wants him dead. But staggeringly, that's not what the father does, is it? The father, remember, a symbol of God, humbles himself, humiliates himself, and graciously agrees. Not only to sign it over, but to actually give it to him. There's a significant difference. He's not just saying it's in the will, you'll get it one day, or you can go to the bank and borrow against it or whatever. He gives it to him. That's evident because the boy obviously sells it all up. And shortly afterwards he leaves. Well, he would have had to have left. He would have been a complete pariah. A complete pariah. His father would have been deeply saddened. The relationship was shattered. He'd ended it. The boy had ended it. And the whole household would have, in fact, and servants and all, the local village, would have treated this kid as a pariah. We already have an insight, by the way, into the failing of the older brother. In that culture, the older brother would have been expected to have been a peacemaker, to have pulled the boy into line and said, listen, my brother, you can't treat our father like that. Wake up to yourself. But he doesn't. He's silent. He doesn't love his brother. just as the brother doesn't love his father. You know the rest. Kid goes off. Can you imagine, can't you? Very wealthy young man in a foreign land splashing his money around. He'd have had friends everywhere, wouldn't he? And they'd have evaporated like a summer shower, puddles in a summer shower, the minute he lost his money and couldn't provide them with a good time. He would then have found himself very vulnerable. In a time of drought, quite common in the Middle East. I know about that as an Australian farmer in this country, but we don't starve in a drought. We can provide for ourselves. And the people of that land probably could have as well. But he, as an alien, was very exposed. Here he was, a Jewish boy in an alien land, a drought descending. He's vulnerable. And he has to go begging for somebody to look after him. And the custom in those days, I was saying earlier this morning that I'm recording my uncle's life history. He's in his late 80s now. And he talked about the Great Depression years. And they had in the old homestead that my father and his family grew up in, what was called a traveller's room. And during the Depression days, if somebody going through was in a bad way and was looking for feed, the deal was understood. You'd say, right, we'll chop some wood or help us clean up the garden for a couple of hours. We'll give you a feed and a bed for the night, and then you move on. And somebody else would probably come the next night during those very tough times. And in that culture, the deal would have been with a sod's owner like this, a foreigner in the land, would have been, if he came begging to offer him something, but usually it would have been quite cynical, we're told. The offer would have been something absolutely unacceptable. And that's what happens here. But the kid's so desperate he takes it. Can you imagine a Jewish kid being told, yeah, all right, well, I'll give you a feed if you look after my pigs? Understand the symbolism of that? So desperate is this kid, though, that he takes it. Utter humiliation. He's in the pig. He's with animals that he must have known were, in fact, feeding their owner. He'd have been eating pork and bacon. Raj tells me he likes bacon with eggs. That right? He does. Doesn't look like it. He's very slim. Anyway, so here's this bloke in this dreadful plight. Dreadful plight. He's having to look after pigs which are feeding the owner. And he's so horrible. No, he's probably not offered any pig, but he couldn't eat it anyway. Would have been so strong in his culture, even as a rebel who'd rejected everything that associated with his father's household, that he wouldn't have been able to eat it. So he's resorted to eating the sort of pods, probably acacia pods. They're very bitter, very nasty. They apparently swell up in your stomach and give you a horrible bloated feeling, but are so lacking in nutrition that you die. And that's what happens. He's dying. And it turns out to be a great blessing, doesn't it? Some of you, perhaps many of you, maybe all of you, I don't know, will recognise that at times you've been greatly blessed by reaching a very low point. Sometimes we see more through tears than we do through a telescope. And in a big way, this young man is now blessed. He suddenly comes to his senses and sees who he is. And he recognises that he's sold out his sonship. He has disgraced himself. He's humiliated his father. He has no place in his father's household. He's given up everything for a few bucks that have been wasted and squandered and gone. His plight is desperate, but he says, perhaps my father will take me back as a hired help and I can, over time, pay him back just a little of what I owe him. I'm desperate. I'll try it. So he starts out on the journey home. Now, his father would have presumed him probably by then dead, and certainly would not have thought that he would ever see him again. But he does. He spots him before anybody else does. And actions speak louder than words. It's interesting that the father, what we learn about him is that he acts. He immediately runs out before anybody else can see the son probably and take him to task and do him in for the disgraceful thing. They wouldn't have wanted him back. He goes out to signal not just to the son but to the others that he's delighted that the son's back. And he accepts him again. Staggering stuff. Jesus' audience would have been amazed by this. They'd have been thinking, surely at last the father's now going to extract his vengeance for the humiliation and the loss of wealth that the younger son has visited upon him. But no, he doesn't. He runs out. He's filled with compassion. He throws his arms around him and he kisses him in the way that a patriarch kissed, not a sign of equality, but a sign of acceptance. And the son begins, he blurts it out, doesn't get the whole story out, he just gets enough of it out. I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. He's got it. He deserves nothing. And then he's staggered, as Jesus' listeners would have been by the Father's words. He says to his servants, quick, bring the best robe, which would have been his. And robes signified standing in that culture. His best robe would have said, this is a very important man. Another surprise. And by the way, patriarchs didn't run. The way in which you conveyed yourself reflected your importance in that society. So women and children, sorry ladies, could run, apparently. But patriarchs did not. The way they walked reflected their dignity, as did the robes they wore. So he's lifted his robes and run. An act of extraordinary humiliation, going out to greet the person, the son who's repented. Bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger. Signal that he's back in the family. Sandals on his feet. He's restored to full sonship. And we will celebrate. Bring the fattened calf. It's the only thing big enough to have the whole household and the village join in the feast. And we want them all to join in the feast so that they know that I have restored my son as an heir. I have brought him back in. The son of mine was dead and is alive again. He's lost and is found. So they begin to celebrate. They do the right thing. They join in. Well, that's significant. They recognise a decision that the Father in his graciousness has made. But it is now the turn of the older son to reveal who he is in his heart and to disgrace himself. The good guy turns out not to be the good guy. And at this point, I'd imagine the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, although that's not narrowly the case that the prodigal son represents the sinners and the tax collectors, broadly speaking, they would have identified more with him than with the older son. And broadly speaking, probably the Pharisees and the teachers would have identified more with the good guy, the one who outwardly stayed with the Father and appeared to be in the household and not to leave it. So they'd have been the hairs would have been starting to prickle on the back of their necks. Because he's out in the field and he comes near the house, he hears the music and dancing. Already started. The father would have deliberately got it going as soon as he could have to signal that there's a big feast coming up. And people would have known that that was the bell ringing, something's on. He's suspicious. He's that type of person. So he calls one of the servants, asks him what's going on, and here's the dreadful news. Your brother has come. Not only that, he learns, your father's accepted him back as a son and heir. He's killed the fatted calf. Because your son is back, your brother's back safe and sound. What a horrible thought for the older brother. What does it mean for him? See, he's about to reveal that he doesn't want his father and his relationship with his father any more than the prodigal son did. He wants what the father has to give him. And by implication, the fact that the younger son's come back will reduce his inheritance even more, won't it? That's the problem. If he's going to be let back in, Dad will have less to give me. And that's what I really want. I don't want Dad. I want what he can give me. So he became very angry. He refused to go in. Now, in that culture, that's very significant. Because in a circumstance like that, where the father throws a feast, it is the job of the eldest son to sort of MC it. The father goes inside and mingles with the guests. The eldest son is to stand at the door to the courthouse where you come in off the street and welcome the guests. And then his task is to go around and, in the Middle Eastern fashion, accept graciously, with a big smile on his face and deep appreciation, whether he felt it or not, the compliments that the guests would pay. Isn't it wonderful that your brother has come back? And he couldn't bring himself to even contemplate saying through gritted teeth, yes, isn't it? He wasn't even going to go in. That is to insult his father. Worse than that, his father then, in an act of great graciousness, goes to discuss the matter with him, and in front of the guests they have an argument. They have an argument. His father goes out and pleads with him to come in, but he answers his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Now, the father doesn't demur. He doesn't say, oh, well, yes, no, there was that time when I sent you out to plough the left field and you didn't do it. Plainly, the boy has done what he's been told, hasn't he? Outwardly, he's been the good guy, been the loyal son. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. So no, I won't come and join in this party because I love my brother and I'm glad he's back. I don't love my brother at all. And I don't love you. I wanted to go and have a great party with my cronies. That's what mattered to me, and you wouldn't let me do it. But when this son of yours, not my brother, has squandered your property with prostitutes, that's a very low bilt. We're not told in the first part that he'd wasted his money on prostitutes. But the older son wants to really rub it in. This terrible creature squandered your money on prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. And the father explained something that this son has not understood. He said, everything I have's yours. You haven't needed a goat. It's all yours anyway. Not just the goat, the whole estate. Everything. It's yours. Everything that's left, the great bulk of the inheritance, and everything that was left after your brother went. It was yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again, is lost and is found. Now, you all understand that that's what Jesus wants us to understand about our condition. We have been dead. If we're not yet united with God through our Christ, we are still dead. But when we're saved, when we're born again, we are alive. We go from being lost to being found. And here's the staggering thing about the second son. We assume he's never been lost. But in fact, he reveals here that he is. He doesn't understand that he's a son and heir. He thinks he's earning his inheritance, with which he's obsessed, from the father that he doesn't love, by working hard and being good. But even though he has the opportunity, when his father kindly remonstrates with him instead of disinheriting him, which is, by the way, what Jesus' listeners would have expected, this action was just as worthy of disinheritance as what the younger son had done, disgracing the father in front of the guests. In fact, the older son is revealed as being just like the younger son. There are two types of people here, but in essence they have the same problem. One is lawless without the law, the other is lawless with the law. Both rebel. Both love the good things that God can provide. And isn't that where we're at in our society? And you know, I grapple with that. I have to pull myself up all the time. I'm materialistic. I think I can do it my way. I think if I work hard, I deserve that new motor car or the new tractor or whatever it is on the farm. And I deserve perhaps good things from God. And I have to pull myself up and say, where is my heart really? Both end up in a far country. Now that's an amazing statement, isn't it? But they do. One physically goes to a far country, the other spiritually goes to a far country. One is brought to his senses and comes back, the one that went away physically. But the one that went away spiritually, to the shock, I suspect, of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, well, the story ends and he's outside. He's not inside. So the question for us is, will we be like the prodigal and accept the grace of a father who rushes out to meet us even when we don't deserve it? And the symbolism is obvious. In Christ, he humbles himself unto a cross and runs out to meet us. And at the point of our acceptance of our sinfulness, restores us or brings us into sonship, makes us heirs, or will be like the older, relying on our own strength, wanting only what the good Lord can provide us with, not the Lord himself, and thus, in fact, like some sort of dreadful Greek tragedy, throw everything away? That is the question before us. So in an age that is falling apart, though I do want to stress to you that there is still time, there's always time for our culture to turn itself around, the ultimate question for us, because we need to recognise that this earth will one day wind up and it'll come to an end for us in a physical sense anyway, the question for us is, where do we stand in response to this unbelievably powerful message of the grace of a loving Father who wants so much to restore us? Will we be like the prodigal and come to our senses? Will we be proud and hard-hearted and lose everything like the older son?